good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here again today for this important discussion. Let me invite Mr. Gopal Srinivasan, Chairman of Chennai International Center, to start the session, please.
Thank you. Today, I think we have an extremely important and most current hot subject, I would say, of the time in front of us. We have a new administration that is trying to change the face of America, who's trying to change the face of America's relationship with the rest of the world after a few years of perhaps tumultuous change that was taken place under the previous administration. And we thought all our members would like to know about this most important of all relationships that India has, which is the US-Indian relationship, and how it's going to reform itself in the new administration's time. So we have with us to discuss this Ambassador Robert Blake. Ambassador Blake has served in India. He was Deputy Chief of Mission in India from 2003 to 2006. He has served in many other distinguished positions, including as the Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia under the Obama administration. And he's also served in Indonesia as the ambassador. And he's also been awarded the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. So Ambassador Blake, thank you very much for joining us today. Looking forward to hearing from you. He's currently a trustee of the Asia Foundation. Along with him, we have Mr. Kanti Prasad Bajpai. Kanti comes from a very distinguished diplomatic family as well. His uncle was a very, very well-known ambassador from India to the US. Among other things, he was also a great personality and a person that my family has the privilege to know. So Kanti, welcome. And as a fellow DOSCO, I'm delighted that you're here with us today. Kanti is basically, in addition to being the former headmaster of Doon School, he appears very often on the subject of international affairs. He's a professor at the National University of Singapore and was a vice dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So thank you very much, Kanti, for joining us. And of course, coming closer to home, we have our own Mr. Seshasai, or Sesh for short, an intellectual from Chennai, but for which he's known, and in addition to being an eminent industrialist and leader of Ashok Leyland. Sesh, as we fondly call him, is involved in many, many things, and I don't think I will even attempt to introduce Chennai to Chennai. So if anything is pure Chennai, it is Sesh. And Sesh, thank you. We look forward to your thoughts on this. And of course, and to moderate all this, we have Sundar Ramaswamy, our own Sundar Ramaswamy, not only Vice Chancellor of Kriya University, but also very importantly, he was Director of the Madras School of Economics, which Chennai International Center is happy and proud to call home. So Sundar, thank you for helping to put together this wonderful panel, and I will quickly hand it over to you to take forward this important discussion on Indo-US gravity under the new Biden administration. Over to you, Sundar.
Thank you, Gopal, and thank you all for joining us this evening, or whatever time zone you're in, and especially the participants, Bob, Blake, Kanti, and Mr. Sesh. I'll just take a couple of minutes to set the framework, but before that, in terms of ground rules, please type in your questions in the chat box, and Vanitha and I will curate the Q&A session, which will start promptly in about an hour. But at the same time, one of the downsides of maybe having a faculty member also serve as a moderator is we tend to call on people. So if I need to call on you, I may request you to unmute and unmask yourself and ask the question in person. So we'll come to that, but do get the questions going. I'll just say a few words and then I'll turn it over to the order of the presenters we've already identified beforehand. So we have the world's largest democracy and the oldest democracy that we're talking about today. Both were founded on a shared commitment to freedom, democratic principles, equal treatment of all citizens, human rights, and the rule of law. They also have a shared interest in promoting global security, stability, and economic prosperity through trade, investments, and connectivity. The US generally supports India's emergence as a leading global power and a vital partner to ensure that the Indo-Pacific is a region of peace, stability, and a growing prosperity. And if you paid attention to the news yesterday, we had the meeting of the Quad, and I'm sure one of the speakers will talk about the most recent Quad summit. There is also strong people-to-people ties. For those of us with foot in the US, there are now over 4 million Americans of Indian origin in the diaspora, whose increasing presence is made felt in politics, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, the academy for sure, medicine, hospitality, Silicon Valley, to name a few areas. There are also now 50 plus members when all is said and done, proposed and planned in the Biden administration, including possibly the most well-known, whose family has Chennai roots, Vice President Kamala Harris. India is a major defense partner and a big buyer of energy. And as a fellow economist, I was pleased that in US-India trade is nearly touching 150 billion US dollars. Also, for students in the audience, the number of students who have gone on to study in the US is now crossed 200,000 in recent numbers. And that about 10 years ago, it was less than half that. So that's a huge push. And lastly, India and US cooperate very significantly and in multilateral frameworks and organizations like the G20, the UN, ASEAN, and of course, the Bretton Woods organizations of the World Bank and the IMF and WTO. So while the relationships that we are talking about, and we will talk about, wax and wane depending on who is in New Delhi and who's in Washington, I also want to get this expertise on the panel today to talk about sort of the gravitational pull between the world's largest and the world's oldest. So with that, let me turn it over to for somebody to lay the broad perspective in terms of from an sort of an academic, but also somewhat of a practitioner standpoint, Professor Kanti Prasad, who will be followed by Ambassador Blake, and to round it off will be Mr. Seshasai. So Kanti, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gopal, the organizers, of course, CIC, and our moderator and chair. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I studied in the US, I've written about it, so I have a great interest, obviously, in the subject. It's fallen to me to just set out a kind of broad context for the discussion that will follow. And I want to do that in really three parts, in terms of kind of three theaters of engagement between India and the United States. The first is India between the US and China. The second theater is India between the United States and Russia. And the third is India between the United States and the developing countries over global issues. So not a geographic theater, not a strategic theater, military theater, but a host of diplomatic global public goods issues which engage both sides. My broad thesis or proposition will be that India finds itself skirting or walking quite a fine line in each of these three theaters, much more so perhaps than we often realize, despite the recent coming together of India, and by recent I mean in the last 8 or 10 years, and even more certainly over the events in Ladakh with China since April or May 2020. So let me just say some quick things about each of these theaters to give you a sense of what I mean by India walking this fine line, which is quite a challenging line to walk. In respect of India between the US and China, I think it's fair to say that, as was commented at the beginning by Sundar and others, India has had its ups and downs with the United States, and perhaps only during the 1962 war with China were they kind of quasi-allies. But of course, and India's strongest alliance-like relationship was with the Soviet Union. But given the kind of larger context that Sundar just indicated, P2P, people-to-people, economic, political, valuational convergence, certainly India and the US have become much stronger. And in some ways, one would say India and the US are closer than India and the Soviet Union were back in the Cold War. And clearly China has brought India and the US together in large part in recent years. And the spate of confrontations with China, 2013, 2014, 2015 in Birdsey, 2017 in Doklam, and then of course Ladakh in 2020, have played a critical role in pushing India and the United States even closer. Interestingly, the United States endorsed India's contention that China was the aggressor on the Western border, when the United States have been a bit equivocal about India's territorial claims on that sector of the border as against the eastern sector. India has signed on, as you all probably know, to many of the foundational defense agreements with the United States in recent years pertaining to logistics, communication, military intelligence sharing, and so forth. Yet at the same time, India has remained obviously ambivalent about the free and open Indo-Pacific, even the Quad, and we're just a day or so after the Quad summit that was held between the four heads of government. I think it's been quite instructive that when Mr. Modi spoke here at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, he insisted that India's participation in the free and open Indo-Pacific was with a view to its being inclusive and open to everyone, in a sense not calling out China at all as the target of that. India has also refused to do joint patrols, let's say in the South China Sea, and has insisted that the Quad is not some sort of a military front against China. It also sides with China quite often on a range of global issues: climate change, trade, sovereignty, kinds of hard sovereignty issues, even internet regulatory issues. China is a massive trade partner. It's either been number one or it's sometimes been number two if the United States has overtaken it. And I think it's also true that as the Biden administration comes into power, India has concerns about the Biden policy, concerns that go both ways. Worried that the United States might be too soft on China from a kind of liberal point of view post-Trump, or that it might be too hard line, reflecting the new non-partisan, quite tough line towards China. And either seems to discomfit New Delhi. I think it's fair to say that traditionally, and perhaps even now, this fine line that Delhi walks is quite a productive line if it can be held to, which is Delhi tends to try and exploit the space between the two powers, threatening, as it were, quote unquote, to tilt one way or the other if pushed by the other side. In essence, threatening to defect to one side or the other if it faces too much pressure from either side. The key challenge ahead, I think, in Asia for India and the US working together, I think arise out of a couple of things, apart from the gross fact of China's great power, is how to limit Chinese influence given the economic retreat of both India and the US. And I point here to first the American withdrawal from the TPP, and then India's withdrawal, or saying no, I should say, to the RCEP recently. So here are two massive economic powers, putative quasi-allies in this region, who've, as it were, freed the space economically in the region to China, with what possible consequences. And secondly, how can India and the United States together make a soft power comeback in this region? Their economic pullout, their rather sort of stumbling economic performance over the last couple of years, if not longer, and of course their pandemic response, at least in Southeast Asia, where I sit, hasn't been looked at with great admiration. Okay, let me move on to the second theater, which is India between the US and Russia. Here I can be more brief. I think it's also true that India has had to balance between the United States and Russia. Russia, on the one hand, is India's biggest arms supplier by far. I think this is well known. But if you just look at some figures, between 2008 and 2019, India imported about 7 times as the amount of arms from Russia as from the United States. It also, that is, the Russians also provide spare parts and ammunition. And we're in a series of agreements for the joint development of weaponry, the BrahMos hypersonic missiles, submarines, next generation combat aircraft, and so on. Another, I think, key point for Delhi is to try and keep the Russians away from getting too close to Islamabad and to Beijing. And I think Delhi definitely wants to try and make sure that there isn't a grand Eurasian alliance formed between Russia and China in particular. And so here again, there's an incentive to keep some distance from the United States so that the Russians aren't completely alienated from Delhi. On the other hand, the United States, I think, has indicated, certainly under Trump up to a point, that it's rather suspicious of certain kinds of links that India has with the Russians, particularly arms sales, and has threatened to punish India for those. Whether that will stay under Biden is unknown, but we know that Biden has already indicated that he sees Russia in quite a negative light, perhaps more so than Trump did, citing it as a major security threat. So here again, we have a situation where India has tended to find itself in the middle, tended to balance its relationship with two very consequential powers, and again to leverage to some extent, threatening to tilt this way or that way if it doesn't get satisfaction, doesn't get what it wants from the other side. A question I think for the panel and for all of us to think about is there any way that India and the United States can actually cooperate on Russia to wean it away from it? And I think that would be a kind of creative thing to think about. Finally, India between the United States and the developing world on global issues. Here too, I think India walks a fine line between being a sort of champion of the developing world, the non-aligned, erstwhile non-aligned world, and the United States and the advanced economies on the other side. And if you read Subramaniam Jaishankar, the foreign minister's book, The India Way, he argues there that India could be a leading power, shaping the rules and institutions along with a coalition of the global south, that is the developing countries, on issues like climate change, global trade, pandemics, global health, development aid, internet access, and so on and so forth. At the same time, India shares a number of interests with the US on almost all of these. It has its own concerns about hard climate change limits, about the role of the WHO in the pandemic recently, in decoupling from China recently. I think it's closer to the United States as against maybe many developing countries who are quite close to China and need Chinese technology. On issues like peacekeeping, India has come closer to an interventionary kind of predisposition in places of trouble against a hard sovereignty view, and so on. Here again, India has tried in recent years to bridge the gap, as it were, the space between the United States and the developing world. And a thought or a question here is, can India and the US collaborate on the global south before China makes further inroads? So let me conclude for my 10 or 12 minutes. India and the US has never really been an easy relationship. And if one looks, for instance, at quite recent posts on social media, you'll see quite a lot of hostility from the extreme left in India, as well as the extreme right wing in India, who both for different reasons are quite suspicious of the United States and the West. There are sections of the Indian right wing that actually see China as a fellow Asian power, and therefore more tractable than the West, which is regarded as alien. So I think there are quite a lot of subterranean forces operating to complicate India-US relations from various angles. Despite the common threat, I think China and the US don't want to be formal allies. That's pretty clear. India simply cannot be seen as in an outright oppositional role vis-a-vis China, at least in part because China is so big compared to India, and is, of course, a neighbor right on our border. On the other hand, I think bipartisan support in the United States for a hard line against China is constantly pushing up against India's comfort zones. India is quite ambivalent about that, and needing US support on the one side, but not wanting the US to go too far on the other. I think with Russia and with the global south, as I said, there are challenges ahead for India-US cooperation. There are a range of bilateral issues which I haven't touched upon, which will probably come up in the discussion. But let me just wind up by saying, I think India will need a clever and nuanced approach to dealing with the US far more than we think about, and some creative avenues for cooperation looking ahead. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kanti, for being very lucid and laying it out really, really well. Let me turn it over to Bob, Ambassador Blake.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you, Sundar and Gopal, for inviting me today. It's really a pleasure to join this great panel. And I wish I was there in person. I had numerous occasions to visit Chennai when I was DCM, and then as ambassador to Sri Lanka, and then finally as Assistant Secretary of State. And I always enjoyed my visits there. Let me just give you my bottom line up front. I think you can count me among the more optimistic people that we will see a further expansion of strategic ties and cooperation between the United States and India under the Biden administration. Certainly there will be areas of disagreement, as there always are, but I think that on the most important issues, like reaffirming the strategic priority of building America's ties with the Indo-Pacific, working on the key issue of climate change, and continuing to try to build our bilateral trade and investment, I do expect our partnership with India to continue to grow. So let me just briefly give you a sense of what are likely to be the key issues on the U.S.-India agenda. First of all, let's talk about the Indo-Pacific. The administration released what they called its interim national security guidance about 2 weeks ago. And that said that our vital national interests compel the deepest connection to the Indo-Pacific. And they specifically mentioned the administration's intention to deepen our partnership with India. And in our government, really personnel is power. And the largest directorate in Biden's National Security Council will be that for the Indo-Pacific. And it's headed by the very experienced Kurt Campbell, who was my counterpart as Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs under Obama. And he was the architect of Obama's rebalance to Asia. So a very experienced and smart fellow. As for the substance, as was alluded, the Biden administration showed the priority that it attaches to the Indo-Pacific by hosting early in its tenure the first ever head of state level Quad dialogue yesterday to, as the White House put it, quote, cement a group of strong democracies that are going to work together to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific. I'll talk a little bit later about the important vaccine announcement, and we can talk in more detail in the Q&A. Obviously, a second area that we all attach great importance to is trade and investment. The OECD just released its most recent growth projections for 2021 and 2022, and India tops the list with a projected GDP growth rate of 12.6% in 2021, compared to just under 8% for China and 6.5% for the US. So clearly there's a major opportunity to further develop trade and investment between our two countries. My colleague and friend Rick Rosso of CSIS and McLarty has documented how the Modi government has increased the pace of imposing new trade barriers since taking office in 2014. And these steady hikes in trade barriers have really vastly outnumbered the relatively few products that have seen reductions in customs duties. And not surprisingly, the Trump administration retaliated by imposing its own new trade barriers against India. And most notably, they ended India's participation in the generalized system of preferences in 2019. So, skeptics might say that such tensions have long bedeviled our trade bureaucracies. And yet, bilateral trade has continued its upward trajectory. It was about $60 billion in my time in 2009, about 10 years ago. And of course, now it's nearly 150 billion and growing fairly fast. Of course, there was a little blip because of COVID, but I expect that to continue growing this year. I think there will be good opportunities. I'll mention just three. One is clean energy and clean technology. That's obviously going to be a major opportunity as we look ahead to Glasgow and India's own very ambitious renewable energy targets. A second, of course, will be pharmaceuticals and healthcare, where the pandemic already has accelerated U.S.-India cooperation in this area, but I think there's room for much more. And then lastly, defense trade and cooperation. Many of you will remember that during the Obama administration, we established the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, and that has helped propel the signature of more than, to date, about $20 billion in defense contracts between our countries. And there's some very interesting potential sales on the horizon, sales of fighter aircraft for the Indian Air Force and Navy, as well as unmanned aerial systems and mid-air refueling planes, just to name a few. U.S. Defense Secretary Austin is going to make India one of his stops on his first swing overseas that's starting in a few days. As Kanti alluded, one of the very ticklish issues on the agenda is that India is likely to seek a waiver of sanctions under what's called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, for India's purchase of the Russian S-400 air defense system, but also a lease of a nuclear submarine. And this is going to be a tough issue for the administration, because even if they're inclined to give a waiver, they face a very divided U.S. Congress with very razor-thin margins. And there's a real consensus in America now that a much tougher policy towards Russia is needed than that pursued by former President Trump, particularly after the massive SolarWinds cyber attack. So this is going to be a tricky area. A third area I'd like to just talk about briefly is climate. Obviously, one of the brightest prospects for cooperation this year is going to be on climate, as both of our countries look ahead to the important Glasgow meetings in November. At a recent engagement with India, Special Climate Envoy John Kerry, who is no stranger to India, hailed Prime Minister Modi's announcement of a target of 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030 as a terrific example of how to power a growing economy with clean energy. But he also remarked that it's not enough to do everything that the world committed to in Paris in 2015, and that our present course suggests that we are headed towards global temperature increases of about 4 degrees, so 2.5 degrees higher than what the goal that the world has set for itself. And that's why on Earth Day, April 22nd, so about a month from now, the U.S. is going to host a summit of the Major Economies Forum, which is the world's 17 largest economies, to try to encourage countries to make more ambitious commitments ahead of Glasgow. And of course, India will be invited to that conference. Let me talk briefly about vaccine diplomacy. Indian pharmaceutical companies have gained a global reach and reputation for low cost but very high quality products. And the latest example of that has been the remarkable success of the Serum Institute in rolling out its COVID vaccines. And I saw a recent interview with the CEO, with Mr. Poonawalla, where he estimated that while other companies are ramping up their capacity, his own company's output will account for perhaps 40 or 50% of the global supply of vaccines. And their institute's shots are not only cheap, but also don't need to be stored at the ultra low temperatures of some of the US vaccines. So I think this is a major opportunity to match Indian production capabilities with American finance, but also with our own very extensive network of AID and Center for Disease Control and other health experts in our embassies around the world, as well as the unparalleled logistical capabilities of the US military, should they be needed, as they were during the Ebola crisis in Africa. And later this year, the US itself will probably become a vaccine provider. The federal government has now bought enough coronavirus vaccines to fully immunize 850 million people. And I think that's why you saw the important announcement yesterday from the Quad leaders that they plan to jointly manufacture and distribute up to 1 billion doses of vaccine for the end of next year. And that vaccine will be produced by India, but financed by the US and Japan and distributed with logistical help from Australia. So I think a very nice, good example of cooperation there. Let me touch on human rights. We have discussed the opportunities for increased partnership, but inevitably there will be areas of potential friction. And I think the Biden team is likely to be more open and more public in voicing its concerns about issues such as the situation in Kashmir, the treatment of minority groups, the establishment of a national registry of citizens, and issues like that. And of course, India will not hesitate to push back. But I don't expect human rights differences to derail other cooperation. Let me just conclude with one intriguing, but I think still unknown factor, and that's what I call the Kamala Factor. Kamala Harris has taken a rather interesting early leading role on foreign policy issues, I think probably to boost her knowledge and her foreign policy credentials in case Biden decides not to run for a second term. And it's interesting that already she has spoken independently of Biden to at least 6 world leaders that I know of, and has been really quite heavily involved in his summits with people like Prime Minister Trudeau and others. She's given her own remarks at the State Department. And obviously, given her Indian mother and her very warm personality, an early visit to India by the Vice President, I think, would be a smart initiative that could perhaps lead to a wider role for her. Now, I've not talked about regional issues like Afghanistan and Sri Lanka and Iran, but I'd be happy to discuss those in the Q&A. So let me just leave it there for the moment, Sundar. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for laying that out really comprehensively, but also your top line, which was that you remain an optimist about US-India relations, and we'll come back to some of the other points in the Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Saish to round off the panel.
Thank you, Sundar, and hello to everyone. I will take off from where Ambassador Blake left, which is the most emotionally important subject for people in Chennai and in India, Vice President Kamala Harris. And the expectations of Indo-US cooperation and friendship were certainly moved up several notches after the election of the Vice President of the United States. But let me start with a proposition that while I completely agree with Mr. Bajpai that there is a certain narrow path that India has had to follow in the context of the relationship with the US, but I think certainly the time has come now, particularly in the last developments in the region, the last decade or so, where the need for the two nations to come closer than in the past and to deepen and to strengthen the strategic relationship has become much more evident now. Now, that's not to mean that India is going to be to have a buddy relationship like the way that Israel and the US will ever have. That is not ever going to happen. But certainly there is scope and there is a need for both these countries to move closer to each other. There have been two characteristics which have defined the history of Indo-US relationship. One is the fact that, by and large, there has been the role of US as a demanding suitor and an aggressive suitor, and India trying to play the coy-shy bride. Part of the reason is, of course, what Kanti described as the problem of balancing between competing powers. But I think more than that, this has been the character of the relationship in the past, and that to some extent has inhibited a faster progress towards deepening the relationship. The second characteristic is the fact that the US approach has quite often been clouded by this hyphenation. It's the India hyphen, or it's the India-China hyphen, or the India-Afghanistan hyphen. So I think this has been a significant kind of a focus, and therefore has distracted from the way that the relationship ought to be looked at, which is to say that India has the potential to be the regional bulwark, and it therefore requires closer association and closer meeting of minds between India and US in order for India to play that role. But having said this, I think my first point is therefore that there is a need. None of these constraints that we have seen in the past are going to go away, but we'll have to work within this framework of constraints to see in what manner can we deepen this relationship. That brings me to the second point, which is that while trade and investment on the one hand and the geopolitical strategic relationship on the other hand are both twins conjoined at the hip, for a variety of reasons, the trade and investment between India and US has really not kept pace with the change and the strengthening of the strategic relationship at the geopolitical level. We have something close to about $160 billion, $150 billion trade, and that is still punching much below the weight of India. We just have to contextualize this and to look at the China-US trade, which is about 6 times. This is not to mean that India can aspire to be anywhere near that, but clearly there is much higher potential for trade and investment between India and US than what has been achieved so far. That again has been constrained in my mind because of 2 reasons. One is that in the negotiations that we've had, by the way, the history of negotiations between India and US has been long. I think at least the free trade agreement has been in discussion for nearly 20 odd years. We tried several other agreements which could be of a bilateral nature, including in 1920, a lot of hard work that went into making a limited kind of a trade agreement. And this did not happen despite the fact that the political leadership of both the countries were very keen that it must happen. And again, we must remember the fact that US and India are complementary economies. These are not competing economies as a way that, for example, that India and ASEAN countries are. And yet we managed to do an FTA with ASEAN, but we never managed to do this, even a bilateral limited trade partnership arrangement with US. And the reasons to my mind are twofold. One is the fact that US perhaps has been less than adequately sensitive to the political sensibilities in India. And I'll just cite 2 examples. One is the fact that the tariff dialogue on farm products has always been one of the stumbling blocks, and that's because of the political sensibilities that that India has in this area. And similarly, we also have the situation relating to TRIPS, the intellectual property rights. India had drawn a very firm line in the sand, saying that India will not go beyond what has been committed in the WTO, whereas it's always been the TRIPS plus demand from the US, and therefore there's been this logjam. And that's one of the reasons why India and US trade agreements have always faltered. The other is that India has perhaps not done enough of soil preparation to receive investments and to make itself an attractive destination, more competitive than some of the other countries in Asia, not even counting China, but some of the other countries in Asia. A variety of reasons are at the back of this problem, but some of the banner issues, such as, for example, the Vodafone issue or the Keynes India issue, they have also poisoned the well, so to say, in that these have been the subject of every discussion, although that this may not have major impact per se as a transaction. So because of these reasons, the Indo-US trade relationship has been somewhat more muted than it should be. And therefore, that's what has characterized the rather lower level of engagement that the 2 countries have had despite the huge potential. Let me come to my third and the final point, which is what do we do given this context? I think the discussion today is perhaps most appropriate because we've just seen the Quad announcement and the agenda that has been laid out for the Quad. And I would straight away pick up from that agenda and echo the points made by Ambassador Blake and Kanti earlier, that these issues of cooperation between India and the US and indeed the Quad nations stand out. And I will call out just 3 areas, echoing what Ambassador Blake said. One is the fact that relating to the potential that we have in the matter of electronic warfare and the cyber security that both nations have to be worried about. Now, the conventional warfare systems is going to be no longer relevant. In my view, the Galwan Valley was a kind of a distraction. The fisticuff that we saw was a kind of a planned distraction. The true war that we're going to be facing and something that we need to be worrying about is the cyber security, the cyberspace. And therefore, the need for cooperation in order to come up to speed. What India has been doing is not in public domain. Presumably, India has been doing a lot in this area, but it is critical that we continue in this journey to be contemporary and to be in a position to thwart any kind of an effort from any of the inimical nations in the cyberspace. And I think this is a common problem, common ground for both US and India, and therefore the cooperation to deepen our understanding in the cyberspace, in developing both systems and capabilities, both in the cyberspace as well as in the electronic warfare, more conventional electronic warfare, war systems. These are going to be one very major kind of an area of cooperation that I think we should pursue. The second is the area relating to pharma, but I would expand this area of pharma to healthcare as well. India has a large healthcare market. We have very, very shallow penetration, particularly in the payer and the insurance space. I think it's about 15 to 20%. Now that we have also, Indian government has also freed up the space for foreign investments coming into insurance. There is a major play that is awaiting some of the insurance companies in the US, in India, as well as the cooperation that we should really be targeting in the pharma space. And that's not merely manufactured vaccines, but also encompassing a development of new molecules and looking at a broad-based collaboration which includes clinical trials as well. So that's the second space, and that's a huge opportunity. I think the size of the pharma market in the US is $500 billion, and we have export of about 20 billion or so. So there's a huge opportunity for both to cooperate and harvest the gains. And the third and the last point is relating to climate change, the environment issue, the green technologies which are critical now for India in order to meet its obligation, as well as the huge business opportunity that comes about as a result of cooperation. I would also underscore the point that this cooperation, whether it is in climate change or in pharma or even in cyberspace, have to be really done in all the areas, in the academic area for joint cooperation and joint research studies on the one hand, government to government on the other, as well as independent research bodies and businesses. So I think this has to be a more comprehensive view that both countries should take in order to progress the agenda in any of these three areas. Lastly, I think there is this balancing act that India has to be conscious of, the balance between the risk and the return. The risk of over-dependence, which both the Indian politicians as well as Indian public could keenly be sensitive to, versus the kind of returns that you could expect to harvest from a deeper relationship. And that's one type of balancing that needs to be done, and to managing particularly the public perception on the risk. And the second is, there is also this new emphasis that has been laid by the government of India on the self-reliance, this Atmanirbhar. Although I'm told and I believe that Atmanirbhar is not merely self-reliance, but it is more competitiveness, which is fine. But to be able to balance between what we would call a self-reliance, which is not to mean that we don't import, but deeper engagement in any form where the visibility of a foreign partner in India comes in the way of the public perception of Atmanirbhar, that requires some balancing, some fine deft balancing. I think these are issues which are not new, but which need to be put on the agenda, put as a framework for both countries in order to make a sensible, tangible kind of a progress. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saish, for laying that out from the India perspective, but also really drilling down into some of the granular sectoral details, which I think complemented very nicely what Kanti started with. I would invite the audience to type in questions. I see that the number is ticking up, but I'll start off with a couple of questions from my end. And I would like, and I'll direct it to after I pose the question. A couple of years ago, Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State under President Bush, she had this thesis of what she calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. as she invoked the Christian tale. But her four horsemen were populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism, which the last time the world saw, as she puts it, was in the interwar period in the 30s. And we know what led after that. And so she painted this very dark picture of these four horsemen starting to ride the global landscape. And of course, those events got superseded by the pandemic, which we are still wrestling with, which is a public health crisis. But that in turn, with the lockdown, resulted in an economic crisis across the globe. And what happened in the US with Black Lives Matter, in Europe with anti-colonialism, and even in India with the migrants, so the social justice issue. And you've all touched on climate change. So it's sort of like the world is still grappling with these three crises of public health, economic crisis, and climate change. So I want to sort of ask, maybe start off in the same order, have each of you respond, the fragility of democracy and the fact that these forces have been unleashed globally. And in a way, surprisingly, with the America First movement under the former President Trump. So in a way, I'm curious where you see on the global stage, the space for broader issues to bring US and India together, which is democracy, freedom, social equity, human rights that you have touched upon, in light of this bleak picture that Rice paints just in September of 2019. So Kanti?
Well, thanks. That's a very big question. I think one way of answering it is, I think, to say that what's quite striking, and here I include not just the United States and India, but also China and perhaps Russia and other major powers. What we are seeing is internal and the domestic, perhaps much more than in the past. And this is not just deglobalization, and it's not just an economic preoccupation. As you point out, there's populism, there's hypernationalism, there's a kind of brittleness in terms that's been induced by social media and so on. There's political polarization. I think, it's quite perceptible from the United States at one end through Europe. Russia has probably quite long had it, in fact, but we don't seem to pay enough attention to things in Russia. Oddly enough, I would say China has it as well. The social media there is quite a battleground as well, even though it's regulated, and there are different points of view. Xi Jinping has shown that he's sensitive to a lot of domestic issues. What is it called? I think the dual circulation issue is just part of that. But so I think, one of the worries from a much bigger perspective is whether there's any power today that's really looking outwards enough to global public goods issues. They're looking outwards for competing sort of fairly short-term national security and other interests, but whether they're looking at a much more global kind of agenda, I'm not so sure. We may be heading, therefore, to a kind of G0 world. Now, last thought on that, India and the US could come together to try and, start to bring some more order to things. Maybe that's what Biden will really bring with his great experience. Modi's indicated from now and then with his remarks about, India's traditional classical preoccupation with kind of responsibility to the world attitude. So there's a bedrock for a resurgence in kind of global thinking, I think, especially after this nightmare of the last couple of years. I think that's an area we've been talking very strategically here, economically, and so on, but something about the larger vision, I think, of how these two can help refashion a more outward-looking global citizenship kind of role. That would be nice to see.
I would say, Sundar, that at least in the United States, Biden is really trying to pivot away from the whole America First agenda, in the sense that, there's the perception in the administration that America First really meant America alone.
Right.
And that we really, damaged our interests in many respects, including TPP and other things that Kanti mentioned. Yeah. So there's a sort of palpable sense that he's making a vigorous effort to restore our alliances, to work with friends like the Quad, to work with the NATO countries. And in that sense, we're pivoting away from that isolationism. At the same time, I think there is still fairly substantial nationalism. And of course, you see that reflected in the vaccine nationalism, for example, where we've quite clearly said we're going to vaccinate every American before we let one dose go to somebody else, which is very different from what India and from what China and others have done. And also very laser-like focus on our own economic recovery, which is probably understandable for a new political leader and important. But you know, I do think that once we've accomplished those things, that we will be looking more outwardly, and we will, and you see that in this vaccine announcement, for example, where we're going to be providing fairly substantial amounts of money to help get these vaccines out to a lot of people, and probably providing our own supplies. It's probably too ticklish to say that right now publicly, but I think that will happen. And likewise, you're going to see, for example, the United States, I think, doing much more on climate, for example, helping to plus up the Green Climate Fund to help developing countries to, with the adaptation and all of the changes that would be necessary to increase their nationally determined contribution. So I do think that over time, we're going to see a less isolationist America and a more globalist one. But, you know, I do believe that this COVID crisis has fundamentally changed in many ways, many of these countries. And there will be more of a focus on, you know, Make in America, just as we see Make in India and virtually every other country trying to do the same, and bringing back as much as possible global supply chains, reducing reliance on, for example, Chinese rare earths and things like that. So it's going to be an interesting process to watch, but at the same time, everybody recognizes that the reason the global trade works is that it provides the cheapest form of goods for our citizens, and helps to keep inflation down and very other important priorities. So all of those things have to be balanced.
Right. Seish?
It's very ironic that at the time when you have the digitalization showing us that there are no national boundaries, information flows freely from one place to the other, at a time when the pandemic has just taught us that boundaries, national boundaries, geographical boundaries, totally no meaning, and pandemic goes all across the world, everybody is getting affected the same way. And at a time when climate change is telling us that we're all intertwined, and this is ironic that at the same time, national boundaries are more thickly getting lined, and there is far more of nationalism, far more of individualism that is happening. So it's a bit ironic that it is happening. And to me, that it only indicates a lack of leadership at the global level. We have unfortunately had leaders in the large countries, large democracies, large non-democracies as well, who have been very obsessed with populism and nationalism, and they've therefore not had sufficient kind of enlightenment to see that everything from the nature is giving us the message that we're all one interconnected world. I have better hope, much better hope with the Biden administration now, because at least in rhetoric, we don't hear the same thing. I'm not sure that the needle will swing all the way immediately. The pendulum has gone to one extreme. It will take its time to move back to perhaps the 90s or 80s, when there was much more of a global thinking, much more of international cooperation in major areas. It will take its time, but I think the movement has perhaps begun with the change in administration in the US.
Okay, thank you, Seish, and thank you, So let's get to some of the questions in the audience, and I'll reserve some of my own questions interspersed later. The first one I want to sort of pick on is by Lakshmi Narayan. Can US and India get even closer strategically, and perhaps as a show of that proximity, allow the US to mediate overtly or covertly in the Indo-Pak and Indo-China territorial issue? Kanti, let me start with you, and then I'll go to Ambassador Blake.
Yeah, I saw that. I think there's, when Trump was around, he made forays into mediation, both on the India-Pakistan, and then there was a kind of throwaway remark about intervening on the India-China as well. I really can't see it. I think Biden is too old a hand, too experienced. His team looks really very solid. And I think, whatever the instincts might be and so on, otherwise, they just know it's a very, very complicated business to get into either of those bilateral issues. And as Bob and Seish, and you've indicated, and others, there's so much else to deal with, frankly, that for the Americans to really get seriously involved in mediating would be kind of strange. Although we know there's some stuff swirling around the recent disengagement with China, and then the kind of reaffirmation of the ceasefire with the Pakistanis. And of course, this idea that the Americans are counseling as they do, that it would be nice if everyone, looked at the issue of stability and didn't get too excitable militarily. But particularly, I think on the India-Pakistan front, the Americans tend to be a bit more activist. But I do think that they have a lot more things to worry about, and they know Modi in particular is pretty stiff-necked about those kinds of issues. So I can't imagine that they're going to rush in where Trump didn't fear to tread, frankly.
Yeah, let me put that to rest right away. The only reason that Trump said that was because Trump just was ignorant about the background of this. And, every American diplomat that's getting prepared to go out to post in India learns that India does not welcome American proactive work on Indo-Pakistani relations. And so, we've learned to stay away from that. That said, I think there are opportunities if some sort of dialogue does get going, and certainly the recent ceasefire along the line of control is a welcome development. If there is some sort of process that starts, we're always happy to provide quiet ideas if there's a logjam of some sort. But we're never going to be a formal mediator, and we will not have a public role because we're very sensitive to India's concerns about that. The other point I'd just like to make is that really, Pakistan has diminished in importance to the United States in recent years. Primarily because the number of our troops in Afghanistan has gone from 100,000 plus to now 2,500 and may be reduced further. So, Pakistan really can't take U.S. interests for granted anymore, and really isn't as much of a priority as it once was, and it's certainly nowhere near the priority that India is. So I just make that point as well.
Well put. Thank you, Bob. Let me invite Mr. Ravi to ask a question.
This is a question for Ambassador Blake. Where do you see the Biden administration going on two specific issues of interest in India? One is the continuing and recently increased high tariffs. And the second is the H-1B visas, considering the pressure for jobs within the United States itself.
On the tariffs, I think that they're going to go slow on all trade issues, not just with respect to India, but with China and everyone else. And what Biden has said is that they want to first take fairly substantial and extensive efforts to boost our own competitiveness. And that means boosting our own research and development and really kind of doing a deep dive on what we need to do about trade. And things like rejoining TPP and a possible limited free trade agreement with India are really not on the table for the moment, because again, that whole process is going to have to work its way out. And again, we come back to the issue I mentioned earlier, which is the very, very divided American Congress. And trade is really a sort of third rail issue for the US Congress. And there really isn't much bipartisan support for free trade agreements in general, or even TPP. And so even among the Democratic caucus, and the Democratic caucus itself is, as you all know, we have only 50 votes in the Senate. So I wouldn't hold out high hopes for that. And then even on the tariff reduction side, it'll have to be done on a reciprocal basis. And as you know, there were efforts under the Trump administration. At one point, they were talking about a sort of mini trade deal on a couple of different products. And I certainly think there's room for that kind of thinking, and maybe they will pursue that kind of idea. And I think those are always useful. H-1B, likewise, is always a ticklish subject in the United States. But again, I think there's widespread understanding that these are actually things that benefit the United States. And certainly all of our tech companies strongly are in favor of allowing H-1B or H-1B visas. But again, it's a divisive issue in Congress, and it's very easy for populists and nationalists like Ted Cruz and others to make a political hash of this. So they've got to proceed carefully on this. And I think first they've got to figure out what the broader immigration agenda will be. And then within that context, they'll figure out the H-1B issue.
Thank you, Bob. Seish, I'm going to come to you with this question by Vijaya Ranganathan. How does the perception that Indian government in recent years has become more intolerant of its critics, and that the independence of many of the key institutions has been diluted, affect the US proximity with India?
Well, I think it's important that if we are going to be coveting endorsement from outside the country for whatever we do, we ought to be sensitive also about the concerns that will sometimes be expressed rather loudly by other countries in the world. So I think we're not living in isolation. We are living in a world where the decisions and the policies of different countries impact us very, very substantially. And therefore, we need to be alive and be sensitive to the perception that India is giving out. And this perception in the last few months has not been particularly helpful. It is important that India is mindful of that.
The other one then, Seish, and I'll stick with you because Ambassador Blake has already given his views. And this is the question from Ramakrishnan Kalyanaraman. Both Ambassador Blake and Seish understandably alluded to Kamala Harris in the context of the Indo-US relationship under the Biden administration. In your respective opinions, will Kamala Harris be an asset or a liability given the polarized drumbeat in India around her expected position on a variety of sensitive issues?
But the Indians, and particularly the Chennaites, to get very excited about the fact that Vice President Kamala Harris is in the White House. But I think this will settle down. As she begins to do her job as the elected representative of the American people, and therefore has a certain obligation to pursue the US and what is good for the world view of US. This will start settling down, and the people will begin to accept that beyond the kind of emotional connect and emotional ownership that we can claim, we ought to be a little more practical in terms of understanding what can and what cannot be done by someone who has an Indian origin, but in a position of power there.
Right.
So could I just say a word on the human rights issue? Yeah, I just made a brief mention of it in my presentation.
Yes.
And it's related to the issue of soft power. And I think one of the things vis-a-vis China in particular, was that we stood for, robust democracy, respect for human rights, and all of that. And that hasn't gone completely, but it is eroding. I mean, it's quite perceptible sitting here in Asia. I think that's, it's something we have to think about, even if as a policymaker in this government, there may be sympathy for all kinds of stuff going on domestically, but we're losing a very important soft power element. The drop off of economic growth in India is another card we've lost. And now we're losing the political values one. I perish the thought that we lose a third one, which is the competence in English. I teach Chinese students here a lot, and have to see their English competence to know it's coming fast and hard as well. So I'll just stop with that thought.
Well, no, I'll stay with you because I think I want to hear your views, Kanti, on a question.
Can I just add one thing on that?
Yes, Bob.
I just to further that, I think one of the things that all of your viewers should be aware of is the really, really worrying trend in global democracy, where, for example, Freedom House, which tracks this, they just put out their most recent report, and last year marked the 15th consecutive year that we've seen a decline in global freedom, and more and more. I think they said that, I forget the exact number, but something like people in 65 different nations have experienced a deterioration in their political rights. Yeah. And these things matter. And again, our two large democracies working together on these issues, I think can really help move the needle. Obviously, we're not going to change things overnight, but and India itself is such an important influence in many of these countries in a way that the United States really can't be. So we used to do a lot more work on this, and I hope that we can get back to that, because again, the global trends are worrying.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point, that India has historically remained a democracy in the developing world, other than a couple of years of the emergency. And so I do think, which was one of the reasons, I started with Condoleezza Rice's commentary about the worrying, darkening clouds on the global landscape, and what is the opportunity for the US and India, individually and collectively, to promote the values that we care for, both internally but also externally. I'll come back to you, Kanti, on the question from Srinivas Venkatakrishnan. Why can't India offer more overt military support to the US in Afghanistan in return for guarantee from the US of support in a military standoff with China?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think, no, I'm not laughing at the question. I think there are some provocative thoughts there. And so it's a bit, it makes one a bit uncomfortable. I think, there's just a geographic reason partly why India can't really have boots on the ground there very much. So it's just difficult to get troops in there. I think there would be great sensitivities, obviously, within Afghanistan. And India's in a position where it is trying to cultivate Pashtun opinion, including some Taliban elements. So I think the third is that, we know that Afghanistan has been the graveyard of empires, and India had to exit Sri Lanka when we weren't able to manage an insurgency there. I don't see India being able to do better than anybody else in Afghanistan. And as for partnering the Americans, well, they're on their way out. And to be honest, a heretical thought is that the departure of the Americans, to some extent, anti-Americanism and some of the fillip to extremism may die down, because now the terrible Americans are gone, and they're now going to have to worry about the Pakistanis and others. So I think we ought to be a little bit calmer about the situation in Afghanistan. Let it play itself out a little bit more, and we can't wish upon our American friends that they fight there to the last American. They have to leave, and the region in a different diplomatic sort of way. And I think I'm quite encouraged by Biden's idea of bringing together everyone, including India, on this. That would be a better way to develop it. And if the Biden team can somewhat make up with the Iranians as well, then there's a possibility that at least informally, if not ostensibly, the Iranians may also begin to be more active in a productive way in Afghanistan. So I see that as more of a possibility, and partnering with the Americans there much more. But Bob will have all kinds of thoughts on this as well.
I mean, I would just caution that no decision has been made. In fact, I'd be very surprised if the United States proceeded with any withdrawal, which is now required by May 1st. But as Kanti alluded, there's an effort now underway to come up with sort of an interim power sharing agreement of some sort, which President Ghani is not very happy about. But nonetheless, I think it's very good that he's bringing in all the regional powers to talk about this, including India, because India, even though it doesn't have troops on the ground, plays an enormously important role in providing various kinds of financing and assistance in Afghanistan, and that's one of the most important sources. So, but I do think we'll continue to have troops on the ground for the sole reason that we have to provide an incentive for the Taliban to really negotiate. Otherwise, they'll just wait everybody out and once we leave, then they'll try to take over the country again, and nobody wants to see that. So the idea is to try to figure out how to bolster the Afghan government and not leave it so that we're going to just have a return to pre-2001. So it's a tricky situation, but my guess is that we will continue to have a small number of troops there, but they will limit their involvement in actual combat activities. It's more, and our presence in turn helps to ensure continued NATO forces as well. If we leave, then the NATO forces will roll out as well. And so there's a bounce effect as well to what we do.
I want to ask sort of a mixed up. I want to mix it up a bit, and I want you to think about this: that you're going to play the role of a political advisor, but I want to mix it up that Seish, you get half an hour with President Biden, and Blake, you get Ambassador Blake, you get half an hour with Prime Minister Modi. What would be the three things you would advise or you would request, given the topic of Indo-US relations? Seish? And Kanti, I'll come to you and you can choose either one, but Seish.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the top of the agenda is to recognize that India has much more potential than what has been so far been harvested between the two countries in terms of both economic cooperation and strategic cooperation. I think we need both to be alive to the fact that we are under-exploiting the potential. That's the first thing. I mean, if you recognize that there is an opportunity, then I think we'll both act better. There is an opportunity and there is a need as well for that.
Great.
The second thing is, of course, the fact that we need to have a lot more going between us in terms of the academic cooperation. And then the reason I'll tell you why I'm saying this, because I think if you look at the way that, for example, China has managed to become a leader in AI globally, is primarily because it's quite often said that it's US which built up China, US and to some extent South Korea and Taiwan. Part of that building up happened because of this phenomenal amount of transfer of knowledge that took place from the universities of US to the Chinese students who went and learned all that there was need to there was to learn, whether it's with regard to AI, machine learning or whatever. And then they came back to China and built up this fantastic leadership position. I'm not saying that, therefore, that's something it should similarly happen in the case between India and US. But I think to recognize that there is a way by which we can cooperate in the new technologies from an academic standpoint of view, sharing of knowledge and enriching each other, and having a roadmap for the development of technology for the good of humanity, committing ourselves to do that in the process, have great degree of economic benefit accruing to both the partners. I think that is, to my mind, a very important initiative that needs to be done. And the third is a very practical kind of thing, which is to say that we have, I think perhaps India and US have had the largest number of initiatives which have been launched. I've been personally been a part of some initiatives, any number of initiatives that have been launched, but which have really not been taken to the logical end, have not really made an impact. And I think it's important to understand how we're going to get at least some of them picked up and priority and take them to the logical conclusion of creating impact in both countries.
Excellent. Thank you, Saish. Ambassador Blake, you get half an hour with Prime Minister Modi. Off the record, what do you want to say?
I guess my three issues would be, first of all, on the really big global challenges that we're all facing now, let's think carefully about what the US and India can do. And again, well done, Mr. Prime Minister, on the Quad and the announcement that was made there, but also some of the smaller announcements that were talked about. Now we're going to talk about things like a special committee that will be set up on cyber, and another one on various kinds of technologies. Those are very, very important, and having those four countries working together on those and reaching a consensus on what to do is very, very important. But let's not forget the wider priorities of the global decline in democracy and the global decline of inequality, or global growth of inequality, I should say. And some of these other really important structural issues that the world faces, where our two countries can really make it a difference. Secondly, I would say, let's drop all of the tariff and other trade threats and get our people together, our best people together, including the private sector, to think through what would make sense to take advantage of the huge trade and investment opportunities between our two countries, because we have not done enough to seize those opportunities, and we need to do so because both our countries need every help that we can to rebound from the terrible economic crisis started by the COVID problem. So this is a big opportunity. Let's not mess it up. Third, I would say, let's quietly consult about China. This is going to be the most difficult issue for both of our countries over the next 4 years of the Biden administration. We confront a growing consensus in the United States about the strategic threat and the competition that China represents. And we know that you share many of our concerns, but you also have very, very important equities at stake. So let's consult very, very closely on this, and to a certain extent, Russia as well.
Great. Thank you, Saish, and thank you, Bob. Kanti, I'm going to come to you with a different question. I'll spare you on this one, but all of you mentioned this, but I'm going to start this question with you from Preeti Prabhu. What role do you see for Europe to play between US and India on one of the most important global challenges of our time, climate change? Europe has done a lot already in the areas of research and implementation of policies to address climate change. Any thoughts on how US and India can leverage this knowledge and experience for the global good? Kanti?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't know technically enough about what Europe has done, but my general sense is that over the last decade or so, the Europeans, as a grouping overall, have been probably the most committed in the European Union to doing something about climate change. And, you know, together they represent 20, 30 countries or whatever it is. They're constantly expanding. They have some of the biggest, most vibrant economies, even, you know, despite all their crises. And they have great technology leaders in Germany, in France, in Britain, and a couple of other countries. So I think the EU has this kind of culture of multilateralism, minilateralism, going by norms and rules and institutions and so on. So in a way, they're masters at now 30, 40 years on of managing all kinds of contradictions and different perspectives in a way that I think, to some extent, the United States, India, China, and others kind of receded from some of that. And I think, in a way, my answer is that I think Europe is very well placed by its own sort of convictions and by the style of its kind of diplomatic culture and negotiatory predisposition to really lead on climate change. So, I mean, I guess I would just answer it that way, really. And if I may, I mean, I think on my 3 points, this was going to be one of them that I thought I would say to both leaders, great that you're both very pro climate change. This is one thing to really push forward together. The second one I would have said was, how can both these countries, as I said in my remarks, come back to Asia? They've kind of vanished from Asia to some extent. I mean, in the popular imagination in business and all of that, there's kind of been a real diminishment of them. And the third would be to build stronger states. I mean, it seems odd. I don't mean strong states as in beat people over the head states, but strong governing institutions, which took a real beating, I think, during Trump's time. And Modi, with the best will in the world, has not managed to do much to reform the Indian state. The Indian state is very, very weak. One just looks at the number of personnel per million people. And you can take any service you want. And we come out one of the lowest per capita in the world, least number of policemen per million, judges, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. You can't run a state on such a thin basis.
I have to tell the audience, you know, as a moderator, I interact with the panelists beforehand, as you've all done it if you've done these roles. But this question that I asked each of them to advise the leader of the opposite nation was completely sprung at the last minute. And I have to say I was most impressed by all the three answers that you gave, because it was impromptu, but it really sharpened what needs to be done if you have to get this agenda moving. Seish, I think you wanted to answer the question by Lakshmi, which is, can the painstakingly created civil nuclear agreement be activated so that at least 100 gigawatts of nuclear power be generated in India? It's a very specific question, but I think I'll turn to you for that answer.
Well, I think my co-panelists will know this better, but I never believed that the civil nuclear deal had the sole objective of creating nuclear power. It was much more than that. And therefore, the nuclear power was a sideshow, truly. But it had its, the arrangement had its impact. Nuclear power is something that is going out of fashion quickly for a variety of reasons, because renewable power is now both in terms of the cost and in terms of its implementation capabilities is much more acceptable. And I think we should therefore leave nuclear power behind and focus on renewable energy. And perhaps there's a lot more of cooperation that is possible between the two countries to push the agenda on creating a very vast program of renewable energy in both countries.
Can I continue on this and link it up with Mr. Vishwanathan's question, Bob? And you might have been in the country at this time. The question is, I covered the President Bush, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh meet in 2005. It had a lot of promise for nuclear cooperation. There is the imperative to address the issue of storage of spent fuel and reusing these safely. TerraPower of Bill Gates and the Fast Breeder program of India have great promise for this. Prospects for pursuing this. An extremely specialized question, but you wish to.
I would agree with what Seish said. I think what's hurt the nuclear power cooperation has just been the tremendous drop in the price of solar and wind, and that's just really kind of put nuclear off the agenda for the moment. And then on top of that, you have these difficult issues of what to do about things like nuclear waste, which add further billions of dollars of costs. So I think that the civil nuclear agreement was important because it was such a breakthrough, and it showed to India that the United States was really willing to go to bat for India and do something exceptional. But now I just think that the trends towards greater renewable energy are so positive that nuclear has been left behind a little bit. And it's not just in India, it's really countries all over the world. You see very few new nuclear power plants being built. And so there's talk of smaller plants that are, but even there, just the capital costs are so tremendous. And the risks are still high, as illustrated by Fukushima and others. So people, it's not really any surprise that nuclear has fallen off the agenda a little bit.
Yeah, just to add, it's probably a relative to oil as well. So I think, shale and so on, and production. So it may be that that's also, the economics of nuclear energy may have fallen off as well, on top of kind of nuclear allergy everywhere,
Right.
Yeah. So the last question, and then we'll start wrapping it up. I'll ask Kanti, you, and then Ambassador Blake. And you mentioned it, is the whole issue of Russia. Could you elaborate a little bit more about how Russia plays itself out in this, given the bilateral relationship that India has historically had with Russia, and then of course we all know the details of the US-Russia relationships, including in the previous administration, the questions about that. So the question is, what will Russia and how will Russia be played between our two countries that we're talking about, US and India?
Well, yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think we tend to, in India, increasingly downplay or ignore the Russia issue. And it's going to be quite a challenging thing, as I try to say in my remarks. I guess I'll mostly repeat what I said, which is we've got to find a way, India and the United States, to somehow be more cooperative with the Russians. I know that Biden has staked out a place which seems to be more hard-nosed vis-a-vis Russia. But I think one of the challenges for India will be to try and persuade him to come back to a more moderate position, and primarily because it's not in Delhi's interest, and I think not in the United States' interest, to have China really be able to sew up Eurasia, to have, and so therefore be able to turn its full attention westwards to India and eastwards to the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and knowing that they've taken care of the Russia problem on the other side. So why hand Eurasia to the Chinese? Frankly, I think that's one very big concern. But there are subsidiary ones. I mean, the Russians play in Central Asia and by extension into Afghanistan, and then by extension into Pakistan. So there's just a way in which we have an interest, both of us, to I think ensure that we don't lose Russia altogether to China. And I think that's going to would be a very big challenge for the Indian side. I would say more. I think probably Bob Blake has more stuff to say on this, but that's my broad hope.
Bob?
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think there's a whole host of difficult issues that Biden has to deal with. First of all, there's the perception that the Trump administration really took a pass. And for many people had the suspicion that the Russians had some sort of compromising information about him. It never came out in any way. But, he just didn't respond in the way that America normally has on very big issues like what to do about the Crimea, what to do about the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, what to do about Russia's continued very unhelpful efforts in Syria. Just a whole range of issues like that. And I think the Biden administration will have to deal with those. They will put those on the agenda and make sure that Russia understands that these are important. And now we have the new, most recent challenge of the solar winds, which some people are saying is the largest cyber attack in our history, and is widely believed to have been conducted by the Russians. So that's not yet conclusive, but that's what people are saying so far. All of that said, we do need to continue to work with Russia on certain issues. I would point to Iran as one of them. We have to get back to some sort of agreement about what we're going to do about Iran. The ball is now in the Iranian court. The Biden administration has said that they're willing to go back into the JCPOA, the 2015 agreement, but only if Iran abides by the original terms of that. And of course, much has happened since then. So that's not easy for Iran, and they've got presidential elections coming up in June. So a lot of their hardliners are openly skeptical about cooperating with the United States and the other P5+1 countries. So, so it is a difficult issue to manage. But Russia is one of the very important countries that's involved in this multilateral diplomacy. So we do need to work with them on some issues.
Thank you. So as one of the things that always has impressed me about CIC is not just the level of engagement, but it starts and ends on time. So I don't want to be on the one of the programs that actually stretches it out, because I've never been a big believer in Indian stretchable time concept. So let me start bringing this together to start wrapping it up and hand it off to Gopal. When we were thinking of putting this panel together, as Gopal said, on a really, really important topic, I was very pleased that the three people we approached agreed right away. And you can see from the what wisdom and expertise they brought, they overlap, but they also had the distinct expertise from their own professional backgrounds. And it was very heartening for me. I learned a lot. And I really want to thank Ambassador Blake, Professor Kanti Prasad, and Sesh, for all that you spent with us and answering all sorts of questions. And I have to give credit to the audience. As always, the questions were pointed and but also sweeping and really showed a depth of understanding. So, it was a smaller group than we had anticipated, but I'm very thankful that, Bob, you're starting your weekend in Washington, D.C. Kanti, you're heading way to the night in Singapore, but you all managed to be here and really educate our audience, but also inform us and be very candid and very open and keep the level of discourse at a very high level. So thank you. From my end, Gopal, on to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sundar, for this amazing moderation. I just loved your half an hour with Modi and half an hour with Biden, and I was also making my little list here of things that I would probably say. So that's wonderful, and thank you, Sesh, for always, as the intellectual of Chennai, to give your thoughts and your wide-ranging views. Thank you, Kanti. Lovely to reconnect, and thank you, Bob. I think we all look forward to just better and better relationships between these two great nations, because the only clear outcome for that is everybody wins. And so we look forward to that. And thank you. And I wish all our viewers a very good night. Vanita, you want to say a minute about the next program?
Yes. So we are working on this interesting program on digital rights and regulation. So we have Girish Srivatsava anchoring the program for us. The panelists are still getting lined up. We are getting confirmations from few of them, but it's going to be, we're going to take a practitioner's approach on the whole thing. I mean, where does the balance lie between freedom of expression and regulations? Of course, we need regulations. And in fact, the idea came from Mr. Seshasai. So I must place on record, a big thanks to Mr. Seshasai for the idea. We'll keep you posted on the dates and other things. Thanks, Gopal, and thanks, Sundar, for doing this for us. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Kanti, and thank you, Mr. Seshasai.
And wish you all
everyone who's joined today.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.